Hey, welcome everybody to the Trialogues podcast, where we are currently consuming cheesecake and drinking and smoking and having all sorts of fun while deciding whether we want to talk about the weather or whether we should do sort of a travelogue in a continuing effort to, earn some more one-star reviews in iTunes from people who think that's kind of useless when they just want meaty, substantive discussion about real estate, marketing, leadership, technology, and all those wonderful things. My name, again, is Robert Hahn. I am the Managing Director of 7DS Associates. And with me, as always, are compadres, Matthew and Gaylord. Gentlemen, are you there?
Greetings from New York.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm actually in San Francisco this time, and I am neither drinking, smoking, or eating cheesecake, but I am on the call with you.
If we hear any long pauses, from Matthew, it'll probably because he's, partaking of Junior's cheesecake at the moment. But, for those, few people who might actually be listening this first time, let's just kind of quickly introduce ourselves. Matthew?
Hey, everyone. My name is Matthew Shadbolt. I am the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group, which is Manhattan and Brooklyn's largest real estate brokerage. I'm basically responsible for anything digital that touches the customer. And I do mobile and social and advertising programs for Corcoran. And I also do a bit of writing for Retso primarily on thought leadership, marketing, and the future of the web.
And I'm Gaylord DeWald, President Janitor of Thought Faucet. I solve problems relating to business organization, technology, marketing, that kind of stuff. And I write a column weekly for Inman and also write a bit for Retso and on my own website, thoughtfaucet.com. Normally I am in Burlington, Vermont, where the Thought Faucet World headquarters are located in the Howard Space Center.
But this week you're coming to us from sunny, or is it more cloudy?
Yeah, it's San Francisco, it's like cloudy and foggy.
Yeah. I mean, it's really weird how cold it gets over the summer,
Yeah, it is.
And what brings you to San Francisco?
I'm here for the Social Media Strategy Summit conference. I was presenting at that this morning. So it's a bunch of, Fortune 500 or so marketing level kind of people, a variety of industries and, B2B, B2C, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Part of my focus here for the last year or so has been to get to a broader variety of conferences, in the course of the year. So it's not all just a bunch of real estate stuff. So, for two reasons.
Really,
obviously, yeah, it's good.
And I think it'll end up being really useful for you, Gil, because I know, in the pre-show we talked about some of the topics we talked about, and one of them, is fascinating. And I know Matthew had this whole take on when social networks die and resuscitate, and what that might mean. And you could probably go ask some of these experts who are gathered at this conference about what their thoughts are on those types of topics and talk about it in a future broadcast. But from that standpoint, Matthew, I know you had some really interesting thoughts and insights about around the issue of social networks. Like, what happens when they die and they come back? So, kick us off. What did you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that occurs to me that as the web matures, and as social media stops becoming new, it just becomes sort of a part of the fabric of the way that the web works. What happens is that the networks themselves are maturing and aging and very often dying. And we saw that with sites like Friendster, where, a once phenomenally popular website completely loses its traction in favor of migration to another platform, like a MySpace or a Facebook, or it just, continues to tread water and essentially just plateaus and never grows and also gets eclipsed by, something shinier and newer. But as the web matures, there's been a couple of examples recently of these websites that were sort of written off, kind of coming back to life or in the process of being resuscitated back to life. And I think dig.com, which was very, very popular, is like a great example of that network that was very, very strong, went through somewhat of a redesign and a pivot, lost its core user base, many of whom migrated over to places like Reddit, for example, and then was sold for a fraction of its, peak net worth. And we're starting to see inroads into that with MySpace as well. I think a lot of people, especially in the real estate industry, have sort of completely written off MySpace. And in many ways, MySpace was sort of before the real estate industry really got hold of social, I think. And that's starting to come back to life. They haven't released their new site yet, but they've released a promo video for it, which is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I saw that.
Incredibly polished, very well produced, sort of Tumblr, Pinterest-esque kind of user interface to it. Not necessarily mobile optimized, which I think is sort of an interesting thing that we may see, or I hope that we see from them. But it just struck me as an interesting idea of as the web matures and networks, live and die and then come back, that it's sort of an interesting phenomenon that that businesses growing their product and their marketing and their branding around social are ultimately going to have to tackle at some point. It strikes me as a sort of future-proofing thing to start thinking about is, well, as large as it seems right now, what if, from a sort of contingency planning standpoint, what if everybody migrates from, let's say, Facebook to something else? And how you plan around something like that. So I thought it was an interesting set of ideas, and especially with the MySpace thing, when it comes back as actually a superior product to the thing that eclipsed it. That's yet to really play out, but I was very, very impressed by the visuals. Rob, you said you also saw it, right?
Yeah, I saw that video, and it was really, man, whoever they hired, whether it's an advertising agency or a designer, they're incredibly talented. Obviously we have to see what this looks like. I thought I saw a bunch of examples of them really trying to go with like a full screen video type approach.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm talking about? Like where it almost looked like to view a video on the new MySpace, it sort of stills the entire background and Windows coming on top of it. And I guess I have some questions about what that's actually going to look like in actual implementation, because even in this day of broadband and whatever, 20 gigabits and so on, I know my advertised cable modem speed is something like, 50 gigabits down, but, I still have to wait for a while for YouTube videos to load and things like that. So I don't know if the user experience really will be what we saw in the video or not. But having said that, the design is awesome. But, when I heard you, when we were sort of talking about this pre-show, what I started really thinking about was, I call it nichification, meaning, I knew that MySpace was kind of moribund. I knew that it was sort of dead, except with respect to one very specific space, right, which was musicians.
Yeah.
And DJs and, music people.
In particular, yeah.
Right? So it almost became, MySpace took on this sort of, a niche social network for musicians, independent artists, DJs, small record labels, and, fans who are really into this sort of underground music scene. Meanwhile, Facebook had moved on to this, dominate the world. LinkedIn has now become this, I just call it like an online job search site. And then I thought about, the rise of, quote, social networks like a Pinterest. And I think all three of you guys, I'm not on it. You guys are involved with some mobile-only social network, right?
Yeah.
I know there's some, I can't remember. What's it called?
Foursquare's a good example of that. Instagram's a good example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's all these sort of, so that's kind of what I'm thinking about. And I'm looking at it in terms of human behavior, right? And I almost feel like there's this thing where something is new, you want to be the first on it, you want to be popular, you want to kind of do that. And then whatever that thing is, when it becomes successful, it becomes boring because now everybody's on it. It's like Facebook is not cool anymore when your grandma's on it, right? So now I think people are starting to look for, well, where can I go, that's cooler, that's, more niche. And I wonder how that plays out, sort of overall throughout the economy. And then, you think about kind of trying to apply it to real estate. I don't know how that all plays out. Gaylord, you're actually speaking with a whole bunch of experts on, topics like this. What are your thoughts about future of social networks?
I think there's two sort of ways we can look at this. One is the fascination we all have with the networks themselves, like, oh, well, is Facebook really going to go down? Is MySpace really going to come back? There's that, which is a little bit of just sort of inside baseball. The other side of it, I think that and I think Matthew was sort of alluding to this, is, well, what do we do? What as marketers, what do we do in an environment where the channels are shifting all the time? It's a lot easier to say, okay, Facebook is dominant, let's focus on Facebook. But if it suddenly shifts, and we've seen within social networks that they can very quickly erode and disappear, and be replaced. What do we do? And that becomes, I think that's really kind of for the standard kind of real estate practice, that's really the bigger issue, is all the effort that you put into one particular network may degrade and become useless. And so what do you do next? So that's a big factor, I think, to kind of examine. And some of that just comes down to reliance, like how dependent are you on social media activities to drive your business? And if you're 100% dependent on Facebook, and Facebook starts to sync or whatever in relation to something else, then that becomes an issue. On the mobile front, I think it gets even more interesting because, and I've written about this, but there's not a lot of opportunity in mobile for advertising, just as the nature of the device itself and a nature in terms of the human experience, right? If I can only fit 6 tweets on my mobile phone, I don't want to spend one of those to be an ad because it's annoying. It's a lot of screen real estate, relatively speaking. So I think that causes trouble for networks themselves to figure out, like, how are they going to monetize or not monetize. So I think those are, like, when I look at, like, the reviving of a network, I think that does provide an interesting opportunity for anyone to go in and say, okay, well, now these the efforts that we spent on MySpace before were useful, but now they're not, but now they're useful again, and kind of reintroducing it. MySpace part specifically, though, I want to last little thing, is that I've noticed, I remember when MySpace was all the rage, and even since then, people have a different kind of emotional attachment to MySpace than I have experienced in Facebook. I've heard a lot of marketers tell me how much they love Facebook, and I've heard other people talk about how much they enjoy it. But I've never seen them. I've never seen them examine how much. I've never heard people talk about Facebook in the same way that they have talked about MySpace in terms of their emotional development.
Yeah, I think
let me add.
There's a couple of things there, Gaylord. I think what's needed, I think, is some kind of system of thinking about these platforms that's incredibly nimble and proactive.
Right.
And the idea that your core, let's say your core content or your core presence on these particular platforms can actually be platform dependent. It actually has to be something that exists that's platform agnostic, I think.
Exactly.
So, for example, for the real estate industry, it could be local expertise, right? Something that nobody else knows in your local area that ultimately gets, distributed to something like a Facebook in one way, or perhaps it's photos to Instagram, or it's tips to Foursquare, or, real-time stuff to Twitter, or whatever it is. But the core premise of how you're using the social platforms has to sort of exist independently of those things and be incredibly nimble for adapting to that kind of shift. I think we saw it earlier this year when Pinterest started to become incredibly popular around sort of December, January time. And a lot of people just started to sort of, repurpose their content on a different platform without using that kind of idea of being nimble. They were just actually being the opposite of nimble, just being incredibly heavy-handed and just saying, well, this is what I do on Facebook, I'm going to do the same thing on Pinterest. And, of course, that approach never really works, and it always comes across as fairly clumsy. So there's that aspect of it. But I think you're right that, one of the things that I noticed with the MySpace promo was that there was a very conspicuous absence of mobile in that particular promo. It seems to be very, very much conceived of as a desktop product. And to Rob's point, there's obviously, some technical concerns around something like that. But I think if you buy into the idea that the web really is a mobile and social thing, certainly at the moment and for the foreseeable future, MySpace for the phone or the tablet, is actually sort of paramount. And there was an article in Read Write Web about exactly that, about how the opportunity of mobile is hopefully one that they're actually going to miss, because MySpace sort of version 1, if you like, was incredibly dependent upon advertising. That was really the main premise. Their acquisition by News Corp, for example, and then they did search partnerships with some of the search engines to power search within MySpace that never really took hold, if you like. So the idea of mobile advertising is an interesting one, and there's certainly many people in the real estate space moving into that area. Zillow mobile ads and Trulia mobile ads are very, very powerful and very, very popular. And also, those particular guys, especially, they have multiple apps. I didn't really realize the extent of that, but I think, they have sort of 10 plus apps each. Which I didn't really realize until I started to see some of the information coming from the Trulia IPO filing. So, creating models around social content on the phone that's not advertising predicated, that's a major shift for MySpace in general, because MySpace certainly was like kind of desktop only, because it predates things like the iPhone and the iPad. And it certainly predates, mobile advertising. So I think they're up against sort of this completely different kind of environment. And I wonder if it's really just MySpace in name rather than anything else. It seems to be completely built from the ground up. Different set of investors, different set of owners, totally different, design, UI experience. The web is a completely different place now than when MySpace was at its peak. And certainly the relationships with people like News Corp and Google and Bing and people like that, those companies themselves are in different places as well. So it's interesting days, that's for sure. I wonder if the stigma of the name of MySpace will remain and sort of curb adoption, though.
Well, I mean, I think it's just MySpace. I'm not sure if the stigma. It's so old. I mean, so many people have no idea what MySpace is almost. I feel like the stigma might actually be gone, and I could actually see it working to their benefit if they do some sort of retro play. But I actually have a question for you guys, because I want to try and relate this to the industry we all toil in, which is to say, let me put it in two parts. First question, I guess, is when we think about social networks as it pertains to real estate, what comes to mind for you guys? Like, what are the social networks that come to mind? And then the second question, I think, is this. I don't know that I've ever seen any sort of real in-depth study on this, but I could have just missed it. Is there any sort of information out there about what happens when a social network declines into and ultimately dies? In other words, I think about like the other side of it. There's sort of this fairly well-known concept of the positive feedback loop. Like eBay, all the sellers go there because the buyers are there, and the buyers go there because all the sellers are there. With something like Facebook, it starts out as this very small, college-based thing about, dorm rooms and whatever, and then it starts to grow and grow and grow, and eventually it almost feels like you kind of have to go there because everybody else is there. What causes that to start to reverse? In other words, Matthew, I guess I'll address it to you first. First of all, what are the real estate networks that you can think of? What comes to mind? And second is, if you look at the example of like Dig, if you look at the example of MySpace, if you look at these things, what causes these social networks to decline? I guess is what I'm wondering. And it can't be something just as simple as people randomly just stop going. I mean, is it that a couple of influencers who are posting lots of content stop and they move to another platform and take people with them? Is it some sort of a feature release that pisses off the user base, so they leave You know what I'm saying? Like,
I mean, it might be all of the above or none of the above. I mean,
okay.
when it comes to real estate social networks, if you like, I mean, there's obviously a few that are top of mind with that. Something like Active Rain is probably in that conversation. Perhaps Trulia Voices would be in there. You know, and then, you know, the things that I'm probably most exposed to are the real estate groups on Facebook, like the individual, you know, something like a Raise the Bar group, or I'm a member of a Next Level Video group for realtors and things like that. And they have their own little social component, actually as a subset of Facebook, of course. So I think that those kind of things exist, but they exist in very, very, like you said before, niche kind of areas. Like here's a video one, or here's, you know, one that's just agents, or that and that kind of stuff. But I don't see, you know, the network component has varying strength across those kind of things. But, you know, your question about what fuels the decline of a network is really what fuels the decline of a network in the real world. You know, it's usually things like external market forces, and that's certainly been the case on things like MySpace, you know, version 1, and also, you know, with Dig, they actually implemented a number of sort of experiential changes within their user interface,
right,
in terms of how the content surfaced. To the point where there was sort of like a user backlash. There was so much negative feedback about that change. And we see this every time that there's a Facebook update. You know, people hate it. And they actually take to Facebook to vent their anger, which is sort of ironic. But you know, people are sort of...
No, but so let me jump in here for real quick, because here's what I'm wondering. eBay has been around for much longer, I think, actually, than MySpace, I think. Right? And it's, you know, that network is still going strong. There's no threat to them. You know, there have been companies that tried to kind of get into the auction space, but they just, you know, unless you're talking about like really specialized niches that eBay doesn't really serve, and I have in mind something like gunbroker.com. Unless you're talking about something like that, they really haven't faced any external market challenges. And you know, like on the one hand. On the other hand, yeah, you're absolutely right. MySpace, Dig, Friendster, you know, all these things, whether it's a misstep by the company, you know, by doing something to piss off their user base, or it's, quote, external market forces, they went from kind of this established place where everybody went to literally almost nothing, you know, in a very short period of time.
Yeah, right? It's actually a very, very fragile thing. It's more fragile than you think, I think, because it can erode very, very aggressively, I think. And it could even be, you know, for me, I was a, you know, fairly substantial MySpace user. The acquisition by News Corp was actually, you know, it seemed to take some of the coolness away from it, for me personally. I was like, okay, well, they're no longer independent. Now they're owned by the same people that own, you know, the Wall Street Journal and Sky TV and things like that. And, you know, I think it's going to, you know, we're starting to see a lot more advertising for that kind of stuff come in. And, you know, I was very sort of skeptical about that. And, you know, it turns out that the News Corp acquisition was very, very problematic for them internally. There's actually a really, really great book on the history of MySpace called Stealing MySpace, about how it started and, you know, the problems that they had with growth and things like celebrity endorsements. But the origins of MySpace are actually a fascinating story. But to your point, Rob, about eBay, I'm not sure that I would really put eBay in the social camp in the way that I would with the others.
Okay, tell me why.
eBay,
I think I want to relate this to what Gaylor was saying. You know, what Gaylor brought up was, you know, that it depends on why people use a network, right? And I almost feel like on that definition, I would actually consider eBay to be a social network, but maybe we have different definitions, different ways of thinking about it. So,
well, eBay definitely, you know, to your point, eBay has strong commercial purpose, right? People use the site to sell things, right? I'm not sure that people really use eBay to do things like really outside of the sales process, right? Share information and get together and hang out in a truly social way. Even though it has commenting, it has messaging, and it has the kind of DNA of social, I don't think it's sort of why LinkedIn is sort of like on the edge of that social conversation as well, because there's actually not too much social component to it. Things like photo sharing, that's sort of baked into the DNA of what we think of as social network now, or like tagging, I am here with Robert Gaylor, that kind of stuff. But I think, to your point, when they have expressed very focused purpose, right, like an eBay or an Instagram, right, this is, you just share your photos here, that seems to really be a lot stronger proposition for long-term growth, rather than the instability of you can do everything here. And you see that with people like Yahoo, or even Google Plus suffers from that. It's like trying to be everything to everybody, and ultimately becomes nothing to everybody instead. But
I'd like to jump in on a little bit. So because I think you guys you're dead on with this. It's I'd agree with Matthew that eBay is kind of edge case to say it's just because there's a lot of people that use it doesn't make it necessarily social. So we end up saying, well, is there a feature set that if a site includes status, friending, relationship, declaration or whatever, and then it's social or not? I mean, we could maybe assemble a list of those kinds of things, but it does come down to use. And eBay isn't like a social experience so much. I'm interested in that whoever I sold something to or bought something from has a good rating, but even beyond that, it's like, okay, whatever. It works or it doesn't work. And as marketers, the challenge comes down to finding it's kind of balancing the utility function of a network and the size of it. Right? So everyone is really excited about the size of Facebook in terms of the potential people that you can reach. But even there, after you go through the whole EdgeRank algorithm, you might not be reaching many people actually. But that's the focus of it, is this general, large, mainstream thing that marketers were familiar with for many years before having to deal with digital stuff. And then on the other side, you got the utility side. Like if I'm interested in buying and selling something, I would think that the eBay as a social experiment or whatever would be more valuable to me as an individual than Facebook would. So it's balancing the utility of it, and I think that's really where it drives down to with real estate, right? So is there a social network for real estate, kind of going back all the way back to your question, Rob? Part of that is when we say social network for real estate, are we talking about for real estate practitioners? Because they have different, and even within practitioners, for real estate agents, for real estate brokers, they both have different needs. Or for real estate consumers. Like, is there a place where consumers really get together and naturally amongst themselves talk about real estate? Or are
that's a good point.
You know what I mean?
But let me ask you guys this. So what do you consider Yelp? Is that a social network or not?
I don't think it is. I think
it's not.
To Gaylor's point, there's many sites that have these kind of core components to them, but are focused on really commerce in different ways. Like I think sort of eBay and Amazon share like the same kind of DNA with their commenting and ratings and reviews and things like that.
Yeah.
Or maybe like TripAdvisor would be in there, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Crowdsourced rating systems doesn't make something a social network, right?
Right. It's not that people are actually having conversations around restaurant reviews in a Yelp, or conversations around book reviews in Amazon, although that does happen, of course, but it's not at the kind of scale that we're really is really going to be valuable in comparing it to something like a Facebook or a Twitter, I think, right?
Okay, so then what about something like Foursquare?
I think Foursquare is very, very social. Even though it doesn't have the discussion part, the actual act of location sharing is actually, because it's so focused, I am here with my friends doing this, or I am going to go out and, I'm doing this. I sort of see it as the geographic sort of information-based version of sort of what Instagram is. Even though Instagram has like that geotagging in it as well, and it's photo-based, obviously. Foursquare has a social component because it's what you and your friends are actually doing in the world, and how you experience the world, and to paraphrase their own words, how you make cities more fun. Like, that's really their guiding principle. And I think that premise is inherently social, even though it doesn't have the kind of other aspects that we're talking about here.
Even just the act of checking in is a social signal. You check in to let people know that's where I am, and implied in that is come hang out. You know, either come hang out or look, I'm in a cool place. I'm declaring my status as someone who knows where the cool places are. Yeah. So so that's social.
So here's how. I mean, quite frankly, this is awesome because as happens quite often on these podcasts of ours, I end up kind of coming up with a new way of thinking about things because you guys are freaking brilliant. But let me see if I can summarize essentially what you guys are saying. What you're essentially saying is social, that word social in social network, it inherently has to do with some sort of a person-to-person connection. Whereas anything that has more of a commercial, a business type arrangement, a business type nature to it, I guess we might call that a commercial network, like an eBay or even Yelp to some extent. I think, is that kind of a decent?
I'd buy that. I'd call eBay a commercial network. Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the challenge then, right?
That's the opportunity for the real estate industry, is that we actually inherently do both anyway.
Well, actually, but that's what I'm saying. I think that the challenge in that, I think we've seen this, and it's the issue, and, when you think about, blogging and all this admonitions about don't put listings on Facebook and stuff like that, isn't the challenge for marketers then? Because it seems like it would be for me. If you're going into a network, if you're going into a site or a mobile or whatever the experience is, but the inherent purpose behind it is, quote, social, meaning it's person-to-person connection, how then do you, market or advertise your products or services? And I guess I'm almost imagining an analogy, right? It's a huge difference between going to like a business networking event or a flea market, right, and advertising and marketing and putting up ads or doing whatever, or a trade show, if you will, right? It's a big difference between going to a trade show and trying to hawk your wares and going to a cocktail party, like somebody's birthday party, and trying to hawk your wares, right? I mean, essentially that's the challenge of social media marketing, if you will, in that you're essentially going into spaces, you're going to places that's the equivalent of somebody's birthday party and trying to talk about how great your products and services are at it, right?
Well, I think...
Yeah, but we've been saying that for years, right?
Right, that's what I mean, yeah. So it's totally consistent with what we've been saying. And I think then it's this. Is there something unique about real estate that makes it so that real estate is different than if you're Coke or Pepsi, that they can be much more effective going into those cocktail parties and talking about, I'm a great realtor?
Well, what I think it forces brands to do, Rob, with their marketing on these kind of platforms, and there's a lot of data behind why brands should embrace these platforms, obviously, because it's, to just take the real estate industry, it's where a lot of people are spending their time, inside and outside of the sales process when they consider themselves to be in the market. What it forces brands to do is humanize, right? It forces them to become approachable in ways that they've perhaps not considered before. So the idea of hawking your wares is sort of very, very outdated, I think. But the idea of approachability and unique perspective and insight, and just a reason to even be noticed, it actually becomes a lot more important in that particular instance. And for many folks in the real estate industry, it actually means a diversification of content approach, stuff that isn't necessarily directly connected to the real estate process. So as we said before, a lot of people sort of paraphrase this into local expertise, right? Where to get the best burger, where the nearest banks and delis are, and all this kind of stuff. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that because, number one, when we talk about neighborhood information, that's not a fixed thing. Like here in New York, I'll just give a simple example. Like Times Square is a very different place in the morning than it is in the evening, or it's a different place.
Oh, sure, yeah.
In the summer than the winter. So the idea of neighborhood information being a fixed thing is a huge opportunity within the real estate industry that nobody's really kind of grasped, I think. I was talking to the Walk Score guys about this. I said, I walk everywhere, within New York, but does your algorithm factor in things like when it's raining? Because walking in New York when it's raining is a much, much slower process than when it's in like a nice all day, because everybody's given, umbrella war on the sidewalk. So, neighborhood information, there's many, many opportunities for that. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that. And the idea of the unexpected experience coming out of a brand in a way that humanizes it within a social network is sort of the play here. And I think that, we're seeing a lot of brands, sort of major brands starting to do this. We had spoken on one of the previous podcasts about the delivering happiness things that Coke are doing. But their premise is to, doesn't necessarily start with commercial intent at the brand and marketing level. Obviously, that's the long-term goal, but their premise when it comes to their marketing is actually predicated on this idea of creating something so contagious that it actually spreads beyond their control. That's actually verbatim from their sort of brand manifesto, that they want to create something that spreads within these networks so aggressively that it actually spreads beyond their control to police it, their ability to police it. And I think that that's a really, really interesting idea when it comes to how brands, especially real estate brands, interact with these particular networks. Does that make sense, guys?
It does, and I'd like to jump in on one of the things you brought up right before it as well, and because I think they're related. This idea of actually getting involved at a granular level in terms of the content and your engagement with specific social networks. So a lot of the real estate work ends up with people going to, well, let's get local, let's get hyper local, let's get, we're going to know everything about the area, and that's because that's an obvious direct line to buying real estate as it is relating to a geography. But it can also divide out along specific topics. And I had a client who was a car fanatic. Like, he was really into cars. And this is sort of the example of, can you show up to the cocktail party and start talking about your brand and not be that guy who shows up to the cocktail party and talking about your brand. But he would access forums about guys who are really into cars, like really, gear guys, and was actively participating in those all the time, not as a realtor, but as someone, this is like something that he actually does and he's interested in. And this particular audience has specific needs when it comes to the garage, for example, in the kinds of property. Just like people who are into horses or whatever need to buy equestrian properties that have certain features to them, people that are into cars are really into this kind of garage focusing. And he was able to make a good practice in real estate based around his participation in automotive-related message forums. And this is a case where it's not like Facebook wasn't really going to do it for him. I mean, now they have groups, so maybe there'd be specific Facebook groups, but the idea was going after a particular topic. And it happened to be a topic that he was personally interested in, because I think that's what's required to sustain the activity. If someone else who isn't as interested in cars came along and tried to run his car tactic, it just wouldn't work, because it would become obvious that they actually don't know anything about cars and garages and the needs, and B, they wouldn't be able to sustain it because they get bored. And so some of it is mining at the agent level what's the unique interest that they have, and how, if any way, can it be related to real estate. And I wonder at the brokerage level if it's almost like, we've seen where brokerages will hire people that are specialists in a particular neighborhood, but I wonder if someone would ever do it the other way around and say, here's 75 topics that hobbies that influence people's home purchasing decisions, and I'm gonna hire an agent who loves each of these individual things, and go at it that way.
I think you're exactly on point. Here's where things get interesting for me, and this is, I almost feel like this is advice that, we've all given to, at various conferences or to real estate agents and brokers, yourself, connect with folks on a common basis, blah, 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 blah. The thing that I kind of noticed, though, over the last couple of years is, I would say after politicians, real estate agents are the most politically correct group of people I think I could think of, right? In that maybe it's because they just feel they don't want to lose any business, right? They don't want to miss connecting with any potential buyer, any potential seller based on anything. So there's this inverse relationship, in my opinion, between sort of the extremeness, if you will, of a niche, versus the power of it, the strength within it. Like the car guy you're talking about, Gaylord, I mean, it depends on how much of a car guy he is, right? If it's just more of a general interest, I just kind of dig on cars, that's not very strong. But if he's more like, I'm really into 1964 Mustangs, you know what I mean? Like that's a much stronger bond, but it's a smaller group.
Well, some of it, Rob, I think you're right, but some of it really comes down to what's your level of participation in the group. So you'd have to know enough about it to be able to answer people's questions and participate usefully.
Right.
And the size of the size of the niche, all it has to do is be big enough to sustain a market. It has to be big enough to actually be a market. And
right.
The other
totally
side of it, right?
Totally agree. What I'm saying though is, I feel like real estate agents, real estate professionals today are essentially trained not to do those things, right? They're essentially trained to be as safe and as neutral and as vanilla as possible so that they don't turn anybody off. Which is why if you look at a real estate agent's blog, you typically find stuff on, here are restaurants I like. You look at their hobbies, it's like, well, I enjoy running. It's stuff like, okay, that's cool. And certainly if you're like really into running, if you're a serious hardcore runner, if you're passionate about it, there's a group of people who are really into it. But if you're just like, I just sort of enjoy jogging around, it's like, I'm sorry, it's just not a big enough niche. If there's not enough passion in there. Now, if you said, I'm really into rock climbing, that's a different niche. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like the training that real estate professionals go through is, whether it's from real estate school or it's their office managers or brokers, sort of like, you don't want to focus too much on a narrow niche. You want to take everybody, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wonder, like, what is it going to take to kind of reverse that and to get them thinking more about, I have these really unique interests and I'm really going to be passionate about it. Even on my, quote, real estate blog, I'm going to talk about, needlepoint, right, on my, quote, real estate blog because I happen to be really passionate about needlepoint and that's what I do. And if people think that I'm nerdy or geeky, so be it. What do you think? How do we get that message out?
I think you make a good point, Rob, because I think what's probably needed is that as part of that sales training process, competitive differentiation probably needs to be included in terms of leveraging really who you are and your interests and what Derek Overby and Inez at Retso called your social objects, like what you're known for. Which is, either a physical thing in the world or an interest or something associated with you, and how to leverage that and connect with individual networks, because the strength and depth of those particular networks is going to be more valuable to you in the sales process than broad general appeal. And I think you're absolutely right when it comes to things like real estate blogs. It's usually here's the market, and it's either some widget from like a syndicator or something like that inserted in there, rather than really what somebody is truly passionate about. And I think that it's that level of being passionate about something that is really, really key. There's an agent that works at Corcoran, and I can talk about this because we've shared his videos publicly, but he's a Mets fan. And for good or bad, he goes through agony every single season when in supporting the Mets. And I said to him...
And it will be every single season as long as he's a Mets fan.
Yeah, as a Yankees fan, I agree with you. But, I said, why are you a Mets fan? And he started to tell me this incredible story about what it meant to him, why it was so important to him as a New Yorker to be a Mets fan. And the heartbreak that he goes through, but how he feels that they're a real sort of working man's team and how he can personally relate to something like that. And, every year he thinks they're going to, this is going to be the year kind of thing. And this this incredible amount of passion came out of him about his team. And, since then I've seen him sort of do things about the Mets and contribute to, things online, on that theme. And I'm like, I feel your presence as a human being online much stronger when you talk like that about something that, even that you hate. You hate being a Mets fan, but you can't stop being a Mets fan. Rather than, how's the market? And in my head, I have like a strong sort of affinity with that kind of story, and as a result, he is much more memorable within my particular network because it's a story that I've shared, again here, but also, with my own network online. That this is sort of fascinating story starting to come out of the agents. So I think, there are other examples that I could probably point to where people are starting to be associated with things. I think Inez and her mojitos, that's like quite a well-known example of, somebody that's a real expert on a particular topic outside of real estate, that starts to inform things like neighborhood expertise and, where to go and get the best one and that kind of stuff. But I think it comes down to differentiation, sales process differentiation, why you go with somebody over somebody else based on really what they're passionate about and how they connect with you. And I think... Or even just... That's important.
I was just going to... Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Miller.
Okay. Even just showing that they have passion at all. If we go to 15 blogs related to real estate, probably 12 or 13 of them are going to have a widget that somebody is paying less than $10 a month or whatever to put on there, and that tells you nothing about them as a person. It actually dehumanizes the agent when they have this kind of content.
Right.
That, on the one hand, it is useful to show that there's some market information and that kind of stuff. It's not like that isn't useful in its way, but it does nothing, like you say, for differentiation. And it's not strategic. There's no strategic advantage because your competitor is buying the same widget.
Right.
There's no difference there. The strategic advantage is that no other agent's going to love the Mets more than this guy. Then that's going to, some people aren't going to buy from him as a result of him being a Mets fan, and for some reason they hate the Mets. But my guess is even if you don't care about baseball, like I personally don't, baseball doesn't do anything for me. If you know that someone is passionate about something, that they're a human being, and that in a world of bland marketing, being a human being is a competitive advantage strategically.
Well, I think
to add one thing here, right?
Okay, sure.
One of the things I've had is I was at an event, I want to say maybe 2 years ago, and I remember saying that it's the most important social network if you guys want to be involved with it. Because, we're still talking about blogs and content creation and all of those types of strategies, and I look at a lot of the updates in an actual social network, whether it be Facebook or whatever, in an actual social network. Most of the agents, even if I know for a fact that I know that person, that they're passionate about certain topics, they steer real clear from those. And it's a lot of, to Gaylord's point, this, passionless, thing. And I think it has a lot to do with this notion that, professionalism dictates you maintain this certain decorum or this stature, and therefore you should only be talking about, economic forecasting and home price, movements and 10 things you can do when you're ready to move, instead of talk about the fact that they're really passionate about, they're really passionate about hunting, or they're really passionate about, triathlons, or maybe that's not good because there's nothing, icky about it. And the music is one thing that I find really fascinating. So what I said was, back then it wasn't Spotify. What the hell was it? I was all over that thing. Guys, remember, it's not Last.fm. That's the only thing that keeps coming to mind. But there was this social network that had to do with music and, sharing your music. And I got a lot of folks telling me, like, I don't want to see your updates be about what song you listened to last and so on. I'm going, isn't that the most important thing? I mean, people tend to be kind of passionate about their music choices, right? And real estate agents said, I don't want that on my wall. I don't want that in public because I have to maintain this image. What do you think about that sort of maintaining your image versus passion, which may, quite kind of undermine that image? Which is more important?
Well, I want to answer your question, but I want to go back to something Taylor was talking about in terms of how people find agents and the information that agents put out about themselves. Because if you think about agent search on the web, right, even outside of Facebook, like on a brokerage site or a syndicator or something, when people go search for agents, they say, there's usually a number of criteria that are involved. And said, I want an agent that works, in this area, and perhaps, speaks a certain language or that kind of stuff. There's criteria, right? And they're very, very basic. And usually what you get in the UI is a gallery of headshots. It's like a grid of headshots is usually what you get.
Right.
And as the user, I have absolutely no idea how on earth I'm supposed to decide even who to click on, where to even begin with that. It's just, here are 250 agents who work in that market. And how do I decide? How on earth do you decide? And the answer is that you can't. And it gets even worse when you start to click in because of this kind of professional biography thing that you're talking about, Rob. Because the problem is that everybody's awesome, right? Everybody's awesome. Everybody, runs in the park, gives money to charity, loves dogs, loves to cook, goes to the theater, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And the problem is that it isn't actually realistic, and it doesn't really portray the kind of passion that Gaylord's talking about that is starting to be sort of eroded by things like social networks. They're starting to be more transparent about that kind of stuff. It's like, well, here's what this person is really interested in, and here's what their views really are. But there's, to your point, Rob, to start answering your question, there's a reticence to be able to do that because there's this legacy of professional biographies. Right? Here's my professional image. This is who I am on the web, and this is how I think that I best present myself in order to get business. And the truth is, like, for the online user, the more human you are, the more passionate about a subject you are, and really the more interested in, like, genuinely interested and insightful about certain things, and that those can be incredibly niche topics, like we were mentioning earlier. The more you are that kind of person that really feels strongly about things, I think people really connect with that kind of stuff. To Gaylord's point, whether they're into baseball or not, I understand that this particular agent, feels a certain way about the world, and that's a very, very important thing that social networks are sort of kicking the door down. Gaylord, do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And here's the sort of kicker with it all is that digital media, by its very nature, works to make us all look the same. We all have profiles that have the same set of fields and buckets and so on and so forth, and they're all set up in the kind of lowest common denominator way of, well, let's display headshots and names. And the medium itself is structured around making everyone equal and making everyone the same and kind of blandifying everything. And whereas, so as a result, you have to work extra hard to become a human. And this doesn't mean that you have to be a wacko. If you really are like into professionalism, like and you're into economic reports and that's your thing, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But the thing is, the challenge becomes to make yourself human through these digital tools. It's hard to do because the tools are configured and built in such a way that, like, in order for a social profiling network to operate, everybody's profile has to have the same kind of sets of buckets and so on and so forth, and the same kind of display. Because that's part of what, going all the way back to the collapse of networks. The big advantage of Facebook was that it didn't look like a dog's breakfast. MySpace looked like garbage because everyone could do whatever they wanted on there, and they made it look like garbage. And so it's balancing these things that becomes the challenge. And I definitely think people can go too far in terms of it. This doesn't mean that you should share every single thing about yourself or whatever, but being aware that to make yourself human online is a strategic advantage. In the same way, I guess a metaphor for it might be a stage actor versus a screen actor. a stage actor, you're actually there, and people would assume that, you have to make your gestures bigger as a stage actor. It's actually not true. You have to make your gestures bigger as a film actor because you're not actually in the room when people are consuming the message, when they're getting it. It actually ends up being bigger actions for film.
So let me ask you guys something. If you are recommending, to an agent or maybe a brokerage, because I know, Gaylor, you and I rarely talk to agents and tell them what they ought to do, but if you're going to make a recommendation between having the largest reach, having, be human, do all those things, but, leave out the stuff that might, turn people off or whatever, and having as large a reach as possible, perhaps with, let's say, a little bit shallower connection or engagement, or purposefully narrow, right, the types of people that, will get along with you and work with you, but the connection could be much deeper. I'm kind of getting a sense that we're all kind of saying you might want to lean towards the second instead of the first, but is that in fact how you guys are feeling about this?
Well, I think purposeful, smaller and deeper connections ultimately become, larger networks. If you go in being, to your earlier point, the vanilla, broad, trying to appeal to everyone, you actually run into the problem of not really standing for anything. You don't really appear to have an opinion one way or the other about anything, whether it's your market or food or interests or whatever. So, people don't really, I believe, or what I see from the data, this isn't a generalization by any stretch of the imagination, but having a perspective and an opinion allows you to connect with people or not, and not making those connections is actually okay as well. But having the connections with a deeper, richer set of conversations is a really, really key idea about how to use these social networks. And to our earlier point, it's actually something that transcends the network itself. That kind of thing applies really everywhere, whether it's a Twitter or a Facebook or an Instagram or whatever. But standing for something is really, really, really important. And, I think the idea of standing for something niche and being an expert on something niche is sort of crystallizes that idea, I think.
So I need to follow up on this. So because I think this is the way I'm thinking about this. Tactically speaking, when we translate it, so somebody's listening to this podcast, they're like, yeah, that's a really good point. Here's what I'm really sort of wondering about. You could have a person who is, maybe not equally passionate, but most people have more than one passion, right? So maybe you have a real estate agent out there who's a foodie. He really loves food. He loves restaurants. He loves going to them. He's on Yelp. He's doing reviews. He's got that passion. And he's also extremely passionate about, let's say, gun rights. And you could easily imagine that one not being as broad, if you will. The choice for that agent is going to be, do I talk about both, right? Or do I maybe just talk about my passion with respect to, restaurants or whatever that's not quite as controversial, that's not quite as potentially narrowing as talking about, let's say, Second Amendment rights. That's kind of what I'm wondering. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
I'll jump in on this one. I think there's a couple things. One is you go with what feels right. The Second Amendment rights, people who where that issue is super important to them, to the point where they're going to participate in social networks devoted to that topic, they're responsive. And that's a totally legitimate and great market to pursue. And in addition, many of them are going to have special requirements in the kinds of properties that they're interested in, both in terms of the location for the jurisdiction of gun rights or access to a range or those kinds of things. So in either case, I think you go with what works. The part that I guess the concern is, okay, well, if I talk about this particular issue, is it going to decrease my business? And then, in that case, the reality is yes. There are some people who might feel uncomfortable with doing business with someone who's talking about gun rights all the time. But the strength of whichever group you're participating with is the thing to examine and say, okay, this is the way I want to live my life. I want to be happier doing this. then it makes sense to pursue it. It makes sense to pursue it. And are you going to lose business for it? Maybe. In the same way that some people hate the Mets. The Mets guy's going to lose some business. But I think that the argument is still valid, even in issues which are incite more political discourse, I guess, or whatever. But I think one of the more interesting sides of that is then how do people work with that in in an environment like a brokerage where it's like, okay, well, we have 50 agents, and then there's one of these guys is continually going off on a thing that that we don't agree with, or we do agree with, or whatever. I think that provokes interesting conversations, within a group. But I don't think there's any reason to not pursue something unless you're talking about like something illegal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree to tag on to the back of what you're saying there, Gaylord. Nobody is saying that being passionate about polarizing issues is a bad thing. It's actually a very, very healthy thing. But as a business strategy, I think Rob's point is that there are perhaps safer topics for social interaction on networks. Not that one is bad or good or anything like that, but I would argue that the foodie is in a relatively safer place than the person passionately advocating a particular perspective over gun rights or whatever it is, religious rights or whatever, something like that. Those things are just naturally, inherently thornier online and polarize people in the extreme. And you see this in the newsfeed as we run up to the election, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Right? So, that particular focus, to Gaylord's point, if you're passionate about it, that's okay, but you just need to be aware that, those particular things aren't for everybody, and your particular view might not be the prevailing one, and that's okay too, But as a business strategy, solidifying that kind of approach around, your marketing can be a little tricky, and I think that, there's ways to minimize that kind of risk based on the topic of choice, really.
And the market, whether the size of the market can sustain it, that's really the bigger issue. If your politicized market isn't large enough to sustain your business, then pursuing that is a bad idea. But it doesn't. But that's true whether it's a politicized topic or not. If there aren't enough foodies in your neighborhood to make a business off of foodies, then that's not going to help you either. It's a business decision. It's a business decision.
I mean, we see a lot of this in a lot of the social network advice given to agents. It's like, well, what worked in the San Francisco market, some brokerage came up with this innovative strategy, so you should do that everywhere. You in the the tiny little market in Iowa, you should sort of emulate their success. And of course, that kind of stuff never really works.
Yep. And as is normal for us, gentlemen, we're out of time. So it's normal for us. It's like we could just keep going and going and going and have really fun, interesting conversation. But unfortunately, we are kind of coming out of time. I do want to add that I think if anyone's listening to this and thinking about what you take away from it, I think if I could summarize for all of us, well, just for myself, I think it is an issue of risk versus reward. That there's some risk, but the rewards could be greater. And I guess my take on it really is it's kind of like going for it on fourth down instead of punting, right? That people think it's a huge risk, but actually if you look at the data, which finds that, going for a fourth down succeeds often enough where it might be the thing to do. And as a result, if you're really, truly passionate about some topic and you're worried that it's going to be controversial, within the caveats like Gaylord said, think about the market size, think about the negatives, think about the risks, but the rewards also can't be ignored. And I think that's what I'm going to take away from it. I love some of the things we talked about. So in closing, I was just curious because I don't know if you guys are NFL fans.
I am not, Rob. No.
Gaylord, you're in Vermont. You're not like.
I only watch a few games a year. I love the sport of football. But I don't watch games or have a favorite team.
Wait, so this would be an incredibly educated, So this has been incredibly educated and informed closing. I was wondering if we could close with your thoughts on the Monday Night Football debacle with the replacement refs making the wrong call and awarding the win to the wrong team.
Oh, man. I know very little about this. I mean, I know what it is. I know what it is because my news feed erupted right around the same time that I guess that happened. I am not a football watcher. I like to watch the playoffs. I like to watch real football. Play football.
I was just gonna say, man, I think you're forgiven because you are a Brit.
But I mean, it seems to be the replacement refs issue. And this is an incredibly uninformed opinion. It seems to be hurting the perception of the game. It seems to be incredibly unpopular with the fans and really a massive problem, and combined with what's going on with the NHL at the same time, it seems there's this huge sort of flux in the world of sports right now, and I think on the one hand it's fascinating because a lot of the activity has moved online in terms of discussing actually what's going on, so they're stronger than ever, but I don't really know much of the politics behind the replacement refs issue, but it seems to be something that needs to be resolved very, very quickly, I think.
Gaylord, any thoughts on the replacement refs issue?
To some degree, this is the exact issue why I don't get particularly behind many professional sports in general, because I think things like this replacement refs kind of thing it's kind of like, what's going on here? Why do we even have to deal with this? So, for me, looking at that one, it's like, well, this is, kind of obvious. You're going to replace a bunch of skilled people whose jobs it is to make sure that a game is played fair and safely, and you're going to replace them with people who are also good and competent, but it's not like they're not the full-time people. And if you're going to put the B squad up to run the whole system, then you're going to have problems. That was a business risk that people are taking, and I think that whatever controversy erupts from that's just sort of the outcome of it. I don't see how this could be surprising to anybody. So it's, for me, I'm like, well, I'm into amateur sports, so this is part of why. This is part of why.
Well, for myself, and I apologize to any listeners we might have in the Seattle area, but Green Bay was robbed, and it's an injustice, and unfortunately it won't be corrected. In any event, gentlemen, as fun as always good time, and I will speak to all of you guys next week.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
3, that's a magic number.